Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I am Auron MacIntyre. One of the people who I draw from frequently when we discuss political theory is a writer named Samuel Francis, and he wrote a very interesting piece back in 1992 about the battle between nationalism and republicanism. Now, most of us think as of Republicans as the nationalists. They're people who would prefer the American nation to a global understanding, a globalist network of governance. They're the people who tend to focus on national identity and support that. But Samuel Francis's question was, did this push towards nationalism actually destroy the classic understanding of republicanism? Because Republican isn't just a slogan, it's not just a party, it's not just a mascot. Republicanism is a specific form of government. Oftentimes, people like to say, no, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And that was true at one point about America. But they rarely think about what the difference between a republic and a democracy would be and why a republic would be preferable. What actually makes up a republic? And can we become a unified nation? Can we have a unified national identity while maintaining the things that are required to create Republican conditions? That's what Sam Francis addressed in this piece back in 1992, but I think it is still extremely relevant. So I want to dive into that today, but before we do, let's hear from today's sponsor. Hey everybody, this episode of the Auron MacIntyre Show is proudly sponsored by Consumers Research. You've heard about Larry Fink and BlackRock and ESG and all the ways that they're ruining your life, making grocery stores more expensive, making video games more woke. Well, Consumers Research has spent the last 5 years making Larry's life hell, and they're just getting started. Their work and its consequences have been profiled in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and most recently, Fox Business reporter Charlie Gasparino wrote a whole chapter in his book, Go Woke, Go Broke, on how effective they've been at dismantling BlackRock's ESG patronage scheme. He's making Larry Fink lose that last bit of hair on his balding head, and you should follow Will's work on X so you can laugh along with him. His handle is at WILLHILD. So give him a follow. Again, that's at WILLHILD on X. All right, so we're diving into this essay from Samuel Francis. Now, I have read many essays on this channel, and most of the time I do a lot of stopping to break down and explain what's going on. And I'll still do that here, but I will probably read more than I normally do. I will probably take fewer times to break in because I feel like Samuel Francis is a very clear writer. He is very good at using language that I think is approachable, and so a lot of it is self-explanatory. It's also a longer piece, and I want to be able to finish it because I really think it's very good. Even though this is over 30 years old, it's still asking a lot of questions that we are exploring to this day. My friend ended up turning me on to this essay, and even though I've read a lot of Sam Francis, I had never seen this one, but it still managed to kind of dovetail along with many of the thoughts that I have been having. So thank you, Nate Hockman, for bringing this essay to my attention. But it's just amazing that we had someone like Francis who was able to see the problems, the undercurrents in American society this far out. This could have been written yesterday, and it would be just as relevant as it is today. But Francis was largely excluded from the conservative movement. And so we had this level of insight and this level of political theory available to us for a very long time. But it sat in places like Chronicles, which is an excellent magazine. It's run by Paul Godfrey today. They're doing the Lord's work of bringing paleoconservatism. They maintained it in the darkness and they're bringing it back in this moment. Of course, this essay is here, and kudos to them for continuing this great work. But it's not a magazine that has a lot of reach. And so the fact that this is the only place that you could really find the wisdom of someone like Sam Francis, again, amazing work by Chronicles, but the fact that this was not, widely read and widely understood by many people on the right really just tells you how desperate people were to silence a category of thought that I think would have been far more useful to the right in the long run. But that said, let's go ahead and dive into the essay here, and I'll stop when I feel it's appropriate to go ahead and add or to clarify when I think that's useful. So, Francis says, in the course of American history, nationalism and republicanism have usually been enemies, not allies. From the days of Alexander Hamilton, nationalism has meant unification of the country under a centralized government, the supremacy of the executive over the legislative branch, the reduction of states' rights and local sectional parochialism, governmental regulation of the economy and engineering of social institutions, and an activist foreign policy, expansionist, imperialist, or globalist that costs much money and requires at least occasional wars. So right off the bat, we can see that this version of nationalism, as Sam Francis is describing it, sounds a whole lot more like the type of government we have today, something that wants to erase regional differences, wants to centralize the entirety of the nation under the same government, wants to erase the ability of different regions to live as they wish. It needs an expansionist, imperialist, uh, globalist type of foreign policy that demands a lot of money and a lot of military activity to keep it going. Nationalism and its proponents have historically been Anglophiles, emulating the mercantilist dynastic state that flourished in Great Britain from the 18th century. And for all of their claims of overcoming sectionalism and private interests, they have been identified with the northeastern part of the United States and its institutions: New England, New York City, the Ivy League, big banks, big business, Wall Street, and Washington. So he's talking about this clash that has existed from the beginning of the country. If you've watched this channel, you know when we get to American history that we have addressed this. Many people will talk about the vision of the founders, what the founders intended. And there are overlapping values in the founders, but the idea that the founders were one unified body that had one unified vision is just factually incorrect. The biggest battle was between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the people like Hamilton who wanted to centralize power, create more of an imperial mercantile government in the United States, as where Jefferson and many of his ilk would have preferred to have a agrarian understanding of American identity. Every American owns his own farm, defends his own home, kind of raises his own food. It's the self-sustained, in kind of isolated existence. Not isolated, the wrong word, but existence that does not rely on a bunch of other national institutions. That's the way that Jefferson understood it. And so we've seen that the Hamiltonian understanding has won out in the long run, right? But it represented a very distinct interest in American life. It favored big towns in the Northeast, big cities that were dependent on manufacturing and trade, and it tended to take advantage of farmers, agrarian, the South, those that were not in this kind of clique that would have benefited from these actions. So he's just hitting on something that has been there since the beginning of the country. All right, so the national state and the nationalists defended and constructed was born with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, reached adolescence in the victory of the North in the Civil War, and grew to a corpulent adulthood in the 20th century managerial state of Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover, uh, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. So he's hitting on those key points. If you go back to the episode where I was with the good old boys and we talked about the 5 republics of the United States, he's talking about those critical moments in which the government changed radically: the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, these critical moments where they seem to have changed the way that the Constitution works without technically altering the words of the Constitution. The principal opponents of nationalism in American history have been Republicans, and it is one of the ironies of our history that the political party that claims the Republican name has been the chief vehicle since the Civil War of anti-Republican nationalism. The Anti-Federalists were opposed to the ratification of the Constitution were immersed in the political theory of classical republicanism, a school of thought that originated in modern times with Machiavelli. A lot of people don't know this. They'll just read The Prince. They think that Machiavelli was a monarchist, but that is not the case. He actually was a big supporter of republicanism, which you will find out if you read Discourses on Livy. Found expression in the 17th century British resistance to the powers of the monarchy, and in the 18th century influenced by both radical Tories and radical Whigs. Deeply suspicious of centralized power of any kind and of the corruption it bred, the Anti-Federalists opposed the ratification, demanded a Bill of Rights to limit federal power, and insisted on a strict reading of the constitutional text as the basic law, defending the states against the federal government and the Congress against the presidency, and were generally content with the limitation on wealth and national power that a small, restricted state imposed, in preference to what they condemned as luxury and empire that national consolidation and interventionist foreign policy would encourage. So from the beginning here, he is noting something that, again, I think a lot of people, a lot even conservatives, would be very hesitant to admit, which is that this limited small government, this government that is free from the centralization of powers and the mass institutions that now run our society, is intrinsically going to be a smaller government and going to be a less wealthy government. And they recognized the sacrifices that they would be making by maintaining that type of government. No, you wouldn't be the most wealthy and militarily powerful government in the world if you maintained yourself as a republic. But that was okay because the Republican form of government was superior. So they understood that there was a trade-off, a cost, a limitation that Republican government placed on the formation of nations. And that ultimately, if you want to maintain that type of government, you have to be willing to accept the limitations of the form. If you want to go beyond that, you might be moving towards the luxurious empire, but you must live as an empire. You must recognize that you are an empire. You must recognize that you are giving up a Republican lifestyle to embrace that expansion. And he points out here that they were aware of this trade-off. This is not something that we have suddenly discovered so many hundreds of years later. It's there again at the founding, if we will look at the wisdom that many founders put forward, and instead of just going out and just reading the Schoolhouse Rock version of American history. The Anti-Federalists, writes Professor Ralph Ketchum in his introduction to a popular edition of his writings, looked into the classical idealization of the small pastoral republic, which were virtuous, self-reliant citizens managed their own affairs and shunned the power and glory of empire. To them, the victory of the American Revolution meant not so much the big chance to become a wealthy world power, but rather the opportunity to achieve a genuinely republican polity, far from the greed, lust for power, and tyranny that generally characterized human society. So again, they recognized a trade-off early on. It's not just, oh, well, we become a Republican form of government, and therefore we get to have all of these things as well. They recognized that there were limitations to what was being set up, and that might be preferable because the cost of empire might be too high. Though the Anti-Federalists lost, their ideas, far more than those of Edmund Burke and Adam Smith, have informed the long American tradition of resistance to the Leviathan state of the Nationalists, appearing in the thought and lips of John Randolph, John C. Calhoun, and the leaders of the Confederacy, the populists of the late 19th century, and the Southern agrarians of the early 20th century, in the old right conservatism of the era between Charles Lindbergh and Jesse Helms. In the 18th century, when the debate between the two sides of the American political coin still sparkled, it was possible for the American people and their leaders to choose republicanism and to institutionalize its ideals. Perhaps it was possible to do so as late as the early 20th century, before the managerial state began to crystallize. Today, it is no longer possible. The national state has long since triumphed, and with it, wedded to it like a Siamese sibling, is multinational corporations, giant labor unions, universities, and foundations. All of the titanic labyrinth of modern bureaucratic organizations in both the public and increasingly the illusory private sectors have won as well. To establish republicanism in anything like its classical form would involve a massive rejection and dismantlement of the main features of the 20th century, the physical and social technologies by which modern centralized, bureaucratically managed mass organizations operate. And while the continued existence and dominance of such features are not inevitable in any Hegelian sense, no one save a few romantic reactionaries seriously contemplates doing away with them. Not only do technology and its organizational applications entice us with luxury, what we today complacently call a high standard of living, but also they offer to those who understand how to manipulate them a degree of power unknown to the most imperious despots of the past. So he's saying here is that basically we have moved beyond the possibility of this form of government. Maybe we could have chosen it at some point. But once we institutionalized the managerial state, once we created the total state, the mass bureaucratic state, we created a set of powers and privileges so compelling that it is very difficult to imagine most people giving them up. And more importantly, it is very unlikely that our leaders will give them up because it allows our leaders to manipulate us at a massive scale that has just never been seen before. The elites that manage modern mass organizations and master the technical skills that allow these organizations to function cannot permit the decentralization and autonomy that characterize Republican civil culture simply because their own power would vanish. And these elites are or lodged not only in the state, but also in the dominant organizations of the economy and culture, so that our incomes and our very thoughts, values, tastes, and emotions are conditioned and manipulated by them and their apologists. Short of a new dark age, or perhaps it would be a golden age, in which knowledge of scientific and organizational technology is lost, there is no prospect of reversing the trend towards mass organization and its absorption of local and decentralized institutions. And here we see that Francis is addressing a similar question to Alexander Dugin, the one Alexander Dugin asked today in the Metaphysics of the Washing Machine. Is the creation of these technologies a indication that there's an inevitable pull towards this situation? Can we deny ourselves these technologies? Could our ruling elites deny themselves the control that these technologies bring? For Francis, the answer is no. He's very deterministic in this sense. He says, look, we have embraced this technology and we would have to abandon all of it in order to return to a level of individual reliance that characterizes Republican government. Remember, the key to Republican government for Machiavelli and for pretty much every thinker was the idea of self-sufficiency of the people. The people were ready to defend themselves with their own arms. They were ready to feed themselves with their own farms. They were ready to make determinations on their government based on their own action as citizens. He says that is impossible in the current world with our current technology and the different ways in which we are now bound to the institutions that create power for our ruling elite. Back to the essay here. Moreover, as most students of classical republicanism understand, the distinctive principle of its theory is its concept of virtue, a quality that consists less in moralistic purity than in personal and social independence. Owning and operating his own farm or shop, usually producing his own food and clothing, governing his own family and his own community, and defending himself with his own arms in company with his own relatives and neighbors, the citizen of the classical republic neither needed nor wanted a Leviathan state to fight wars across the globe on behalf of democracy, nor to pretend to protect him and his home. Again, just could have been written yesterday. Sounds like it could have been written yesterday. Nor did he need or want a job in someone else's company, or a pension plan, or health benefits, or paid vacation, or 5 hour work days. He did not want to shop in vast shopping malls where nothing is worth buying and nothing bought will last a year. It did not occur to him to enroll himself or his children in therapy courses or in sensitivity and human relations clinics in order to find out how to get along with his neighbors. And he sought no edification or instruction from the mass media to entertain him continuously or indoctrinate him with the current cliches and slogans of public discussion or trick him into buying even more junk from which he had no use and no desire. If the citizen succumbed to such temptations, then he had become a dependent on someone or he became dependent on someone or something other than himself and his extensions in family and community. Men who become dependent on others cannot govern themselves, and they cannot govern themselves. If they cannot govern themselves, they cannot keep a republic. This is the bug man, right? This is the bug man. This is Nietzsche's bug. This is Nietzsche's last man, the guy who has traded all agency, all will, all self-determination for comforts, just to be left alone, to not be bothered, to have plenty, but to not have to worry about existential conflicts, to not have to go out and earn a living. That this is what he's talking about. He says the person who is a Republican in the classical sense is looking to do it all themselves, to rely on those local or community ties, but not looking for the state to step in. They would not expect state organizations to take care of them. If they needed organizations, they would make them themselves. And so this is his real point, is that we have lost the virtue necessary. Not only have we lost the virtue necessary, the very institutions, the very mechanisms of power we have created specifically rob us of that virtue. They encourage us not to create the level of virtue, to cultivate the level of virtue necessary to operate as a Republican government. Today, virtually everyone in the United States is habituated to a style of living that is wrapped up in dependency on mass organizations of one kind or another: supermarkets, hospitals, insurance companies, and the bureaucratized police, local government, the mass media, the factories, the office buildings where we work, the apartment complexes and suburban communities where we live, and the massive, remote, and mysterious national state that supervises almost every detail of our lives. Most Americans cannot even imagine a life without such dependencies and would not want to live without them if they could imagine it. The classical Republicans were right. Having become dependent on others for our livelihood, our protection, our entertainment, and even our thoughts and tastes, we are corrupted. We neither want neither want a republic, nor could we keep it if we had one. We do not deserve to have one, and like the barbarians conquered and enslaved by the Greeks and the Romans, we are suited only for servitude. He says very basically here, we have abandoned the virtue that made us capable of operating a republic. So if you even offered people a republic at this point, they would not take it. So conservatives running around and saying we're a republic, not a democracy, would not be willing to make the sacrifices necessary to actually make that statement true, to return us to actual Republican virtue. Back to the essay here. He says classical republicanism then is defunct as a serious political alternative to the present regime. But this does not mean that Americans should either embrace the old Hamiltonian nationalism or merely squat passively in their kennels waiting for the next whistle from their masters. Even though virtually no one today subscribes or adheres to the classical Republican ideal of virtue and independence, even though most Americans are too corrupt in Republican terms to support a republic, there remains a large number of Americans, perhaps a majority, whose material interests and most deeply held culture codes as endangered by the national and increasingly supranational managerial regime. These middle Americans, largely white and middle class, derive their income from their dependence on the mass structures of the managerial economy. And because many of them have long since lost their habits of self-reliance, they are dependent on the services of the government, at least indirectly, and the dominant culture. Yet despite their dependence, the regime does little for them and much to them. They find that their jobs are insecure, their savings stripped of value, their neighborhoods and schools and homes unsafe, their elected leaders indifferent and often crooked, their moral beliefs and religious professions and local codes under perpetual attack, even from their own government. Their children taught to despise what they believe, their very identity and heritage as people threatened, in their future, political, economic, cultural, racial, national, and personal, uncertain. They find that no matter which party or candidate they support, no matter what the candidates and no matter what the candidates and parties promise, nothing substantially changes except for the worse. Although they do the labor that sustains the managerial system, pay the taxes that support it, fight the wars its leaders devise, raise the families, and try to pass on the beliefs and habits that enable the regime and the country to exist and survive, they receive from the regime, or what they receive from the regime is never commensurate with what they give. So he says here basically, look, the Republican form is dead. We can't go back. We have gone too far, both technologically and unfortunately, we have devolved morally and in self discipline and virtue. We could not put it back together if we wanted to. That said, there is a block of middle Americans who are treated like garbage, right? They fight the wars, they pay the taxes, they deliver the food, the gas, they make sure it gets grown, they defend the country, they enforce the law, but they're treated like crap all the time. Again, he wrote this 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, but it could have been written yesterday. It says all of the things that we are experiencing right now. And so he says, even though that form of republicanism is dead, there is still a constituency that was the core of that Republican identity. And even though that constituency has become more dependent on a larger nationalist state than was ever intended by many of the founders, ultimately, that is still a group of people that needs to be spoken for. So if we can't speak for them through the Republican ideal, how do we serve their interests? What is the way in which we actually address it? He says it's not just the Hamiltonian nationalism, but there is a version of nationalism that might allow us to work for these people. He says they are the Americans sneered at as the Bubba voters. You might call them deplorables today. Mocked as Archie Bunkers and denounced as racists, sexists, anti-Semites, xenophobes, homophobes, and hate criminals who haunt the dark corners of the land, the dark side of America, even as their own energy, sacrifice, and commitment make possible the regime and the elite that despise them, exploit them, and dispossess them. They are at once the real victims of the regime and the core or nucleus of American civilization, the real America, the American nation. Again, spot on. 30 years ago, hits this on the head that the regime is the biggest enemy of middle America, not some foreign power endangering us, though you obviously have to defend against that. But the regime itself is at war with middle America. He saw this coming 30 years ago. It's still accurate. Throughout this century, middle Americans have gradually acquired a collective consciousness, an awareness of who they are and what this position is in the regime that exploits them. In economically prosperous periods, the radicalism of the consciousness is largely dormant. But in the Depression and the inflationary crunch of the 1970s, the recessions of the early 1980s and the early 1990s, material insecurity has served as a trigger for heightened consciousness, a radicalization, a sharper self-perception of their plight. Neither liberalism and the ideologies of the left, nor mainstream conservatism, an entrepreneurial version of classic republicanism, adequately expresses their plight or their interests and values or offers much of a solution. So he says both the conservatives and the Democrats have no answer for what is ailing middle America. Continuing with the essay here. The left offers nothing but economic redistribution predicated on egalitarianism and universalist dogmas. And in practice, this means that liberal left policies reflect the interests of non-white underclass and the intelligentsia that designs the formulas and policies of the left. Hence, the left is incapable of defining the specific specific interests and concrete cultural forms of Middle America. The right, though it defends, in theory, Middle American cultural norms and institutions, offers a vision of decentralism, strict constitutionalism, economic individualism, and a minimal state that fails to speak to the Middle American material interests and the challenges that they typically encounter. What Middle Americans need in a political formula and a public myth that synthesizes the attention to material economic interests offered by the left with a defense of concrete cultural and national identity offered by the right. The division of the American political spectrum into the categories of right and left makes the political expression of such a formula virtually impossible. So he says that the classic Republican formula has ignored all the things that the left has done basically to Americans, the huge change that has occurred in America during this time. And so the model it's offering to Middle Americans doesn't actually address their problems. In an ideal world, it would, but it is not addressing any of the new challenges that have arisen. And therefore, it is not speaking to the things that are necessary for Middle America to survive. And so he says what we need is a new type of populism that is going to pay attention to the economic concerns of Middle America while still protecting their actual culture and identity. And this, by the way, is what we're seeing from Donald Trump. Not perfectly, to be clear. However, what we see here is why Donald Trump stands out, right? Because he broke this mold. That kind of classic conservative, economic, laissez-faire, we only free trade, but we got to go to war all the time for some reason. But also we say we're going to protect all these American values and all this American culture, but we encourage all these corporations that actually destroy American culture to ship all the jobs overseas. Like, he recognizes this contradiction and says we need a politician that will marry these two things together. Now, of course, Donald Trump is only doing what Pat Buchanan tried to do, right? So it's not like Donald Trump invented the wheel here. However, he is predicting that what we needed was a Pat Buchanan-esque candidate, and that's what Trump is, right? Trump is the reemergence of this paleo-conservative understanding that says we are going to look at the actual conditions of Middle America, and we're going to speak to the conditions of Middle America while protecting their culture and their national identity. We're not going to be the left who says, we'll give you all this free stuff, but we're going to destroy everything you believe in. And we're not going to be the right and say, well, just, I guess we don't care. Corporations can ship all your jobs overseas. We don't care about the destruction of family formation or any of these things. But in theory, we'll defend your Christian values. Like, he says, we need a real defense of the actual material interests of the middle class that is married on to a defense of their identity and their Christian values. Back to the essay here. The appropriate formula for the expression of Middle American material interests and cultural values is nationalism. The managerial state and its linked economic and cultural structures have succeeded in breaking down the regional variations, local and sexual autonomy, the institutional stability and independence of Middle Americans. And the regime now lurches happily towards a globalization that seeks to integrate all Americans and all other people as well into a planetary political, economic, demographic, and cultural order in which national identity will eventually disappear entirely. Again, 30 years ago. He wrote this in 1992. The homogenization of subnational, social, and religion and regional differences through political centralization, urbanization, and mobility, mass communication, and mass consumption and production means that the older, decentralized identities of particular social classes, sections, communities, and religious and ethnic groups no longer effectively mobilize Americans for political action. Identities such as Southerners or Midwesterners or Catholic or Protestant or Anglo-Saxon Old Stock or European ethnic, small businessman or assembly line worker no longer seem to offer sufficient bonds of common interest for serious political cooperation for any goal beyond immediate special interests. The emerging identity of a Middle America, however, appears to convey sufficient meaning to serve as the foundation of a politically and socially important force and a nationalism that is politically and culturally based on middle Americans, expresses their material interests, and affirms their cultural norms as the dominant public myth of American civilization, is today the only possible vehicle for effective resistance to the managerial globalism and national and cultural extinction it threatens. So he says, look, all these smaller identities that used to allow for republicanism, that are allowed for this regional autonomy, this regional rule, this self-identity and independence, unfortunately, sadly, those have been broken down. No matter how we feel about it, and I feel very bad about it, they have lost their pull. They have weakened. And so even though he says nationalism in its original form destroyed many of these identities, it is now the only meta identity left that can bind people together against the ultimate meta identity, which is globalism. So while we think of nationalism as this positive force against globalism, and it is, the reason we have globalism is nationalism dissolved all of the intermediate institutions and intermediate identities before we got to nationalism, and then continued beyond the nation to go to the globe. The ability to rally around the nation is the last remaining binding agent for these different lost identities. Now, I hope ultimately he's wrong, that these identities can be rediscovered, that this breakdown of kind of the particular can be reversed. But until then, working as a populist nationalist is the best way to create this scenario, right? It's the best way to actually organize these people who otherwise would not be ready for collective action. Moreover, only nationalism seems capable of organizing offensively on a collective scale. One reason for the failure of classical republicanism and similar decentralist movements was that they were capable of only defensive maneuvering and were never able to become, or rather to overcome, divisions of particular and divergent interests and identities sufficiently to organize an effective offensive strategy aimed at dominance rather than merely survival and liberty. So basically, he says these old identities allowed for this Republican virtue and this individualism and this particularism, but it also made it difficult to organize. And so the nationalism allows for a larger scale of organization. Even though it may break down all these smaller identities, it might be the only thing defensible. Again, to point to Alexander Dugin's work, he believes that civilizational blocks are the only thing that battle against globalism. So for Dugin, even the nation is not sufficient. Nationalism is not sufficient. You really need empires. You really need civilizational blocks in order to counter globalism. Again, you can judge whether or not you think that's right or wrong, but they're both observing the same phenomenon: the breakdown of these individual identities and the necessity of some meta identity that is bigger than the region or the republic, but is smaller than the globe. That's really what we're trying to settle on: is what is the smaller operational identity? Can we operate on a regional scale, a national scale, a civilizational scale, or a global scale? Which one can we retreat to or organize around to actually push back against what is happening right now? The defensive strategy mounted by the Confederacy during the Civil War was one of the main reasons for its military defeat, and similar defensiveness has crippled conservative tactics as well. Man, does that still speak true? Again, 30 years later. Activated only by immediate threats to local or private interests, conservative forces have organized mainly around striking personalities and single issue, like tax revolts, religious and social issues of largely sectarian concern, and anti-busing and educational movements, anti-communism, deregulation, term limits. They tend to disband or wither when their favorite personality is elected, or the threats of their immediate interests and pet causes seem to be pushed back. Again, just a perfect description of our current problem, right? Like, if that does not describe the problem of conservatism to a T, I cannot tell you what. Like, that is an amazing distillation of the problem that conservatives have faced for a very long time. that they are unable to stay focused, that they organize around a regional or a particular issue concern, but they can never continue to bring the pressure, that the minute that a charismatic figure blows through town, they rally around them, push for a while, maybe win a few things, but overall are not able to maintain the momentum and coherency of their movement. Again, written 30 years ago, could have been written yesterday. Nationalism, though its historically proven capacity to mobilize passions of mass solidarity and sacrifice and its aggressive invocation of collective identity, offers a practical instrument for overcoming the burden of purely defensive conservatism and aspiring to enduring political power. Cultural and political power. The old the old nationalism of the Hamiltonian tradition will not suffice for this purpose, however. It was the explicit mission of Hamiltonian nationalism to obliterate what Hamilton's best and most recent biographer, Forrest MacDonald, called the inertia of a social order whose pervasive attributes were provincialism and lassitude. The means by which Hamilton determined to accomplish the revolutionary change was money, wealth, economic growth, aided and supported by the national state to transform the established order. Professor MacDonald writes, to make society fluid and open to merit, to make industry both rewarding and necessary, all that needed to be done was to monetize the whole, to rig the rules of the game so that money would become the universal measure of all of the value of things. For money is oblivious to class, status, color, and inherited social position. Money is the ultimate neutral, impersonal arbiter. Infused into its oligarchical, agrarian social order, money could be the leaven, the fermenting yeast that would stimulate growth and change, prosperity, and national strength. So basically, he says here, money dissolves everything. The liquidity of capital dissolves all these identities. And so by embracing a more mercantile existence, by making money the main thing to decide where you should be, where you should stand, you dissolve all these natural hierarchies, and instead we end up with our current situation. But by making money the universal measure of the value of things, the defining principle of the national identity, and joining it to the centralized power, Hamilton ultimately defeated his own purposes. In the first place, because his nationalism set itself against existing social institutions and habits, it was necessarily alienated from and adversarial towards the norms by which most Americans lived. And its alienation was persisted for 2 centuries to inform the cultural style and attitudes of the dominant elites of the managerial system toward the rest of the country. So he says, from the beginning, this form of governance, this way to organize the economy and the culture, necessarily set the ruling elite against the core identity and beliefs of the people. Secondly, because his nationalism was based on the abstraction of money, it was unable to win the support of any but economically ambitious Americans, and unable to express or sustain a genuinely national or even a genuine social bond. Hence, Hamilton's nationalism, rational, calculated, pragmatic, degenerated into a mask for individual, factional, and sectional acquisitions. It was not and could not be an authentic nationalism that controlled and disciplined the parts within the whole, but only a pseudo-nationalism that allowed the parts to seize control of the whole and define the whole in terms of parts and their interests. In another of Hamilton's biographers, John C. Miller writes, the failure of Hamilton's nationalism probably stemmed from the fact that he associated the national government with no great moral issue capable of capturing the popular imagination. He seems to stand only on the natural right of great fishes to eat up the little ones whenever they can catch them. So basically, by basing the entire ethos of the republic on money, you basically dissolved all the things that made republicanism possible. And if you had had a nationalism that unified people over a shared idea, a shared notion of who they were, then that might have been okay. You might have still fused people together in a more lasting way. But because it was really this like open and empty commercialism that was the vehicle by which you attempted to unify the state, what you really just ended up doing was dissolving all the more organic bonds that might have really held people together. Again, 30 years ago. American nationalism after Hamilton, especially through Abraham Lincoln, sought to rectify this flaw by defining the ideal of the national unity in terms of, more accurately, masking it with a great moral issue. Manifest Destiny was one such issue, and it quickly became a mask for territorial expansion, surviving in Wilsonian internationalism and messianic anti-communism of the Cold War liberalism and the global democratism and the new world order of post-Cold War neoconservatism. Equality has another such issue, and it is too served as a mask for acquisitive individualism. Harry Jaffa, those who don't know, Harry Jaffa is kind of the favorite philosopher of the Claremont Institute. Harry Jaffa is in a sense correct that the principle of equality as he perceives it is the declaration of, in the Declaration of Independence and in Lincoln's thought is the ground of the recognition of the human deficiencies which arise naturally, but in civil society when human industry and acquisitiveness are emancipated. Though he is wrong in claiming that equality is far from enfranchising any leveling action of government, the very process of which human acquisitiveness is emancipated involves the obliteration of the state of social barriers to acquisitiveness, and so it did in the attack on property and federalism that Lincoln unleashed in the Civil War. Basically, and to allow for this level of acquisition, you must break down the social barriers. You must get rid of those natural hierarchies. You must get rid of those historical prejudices and understandings of how things should be put together. Hence, M.E. Bradford is also, and more importantly, correct when he writes that the depredations and corruptions of the Gilded Age in the area of Great Barbecue, the original vulture capitalism, began either under Lincoln's direction or with his sponsorship, and that Lincoln's administration laid the cornerstone of the great alteration of the posture of the federal government towards the sponsorship of business. It was indeed the cornerstone of the modern corporate state on which the twin towers of managerial capitalism and managerial government are grounded. The great moral issues that the old nationalism eventually selected, therefore, were little more than fantastic and easily penetrated costumes in which older human passions of greed and lust for power sallied forth to their orgy. Precisely because the old nationalism assumed an adversarial relationship towards the norms and institutions to which most Americans adhered, it could locate few forces in American society with which it could join, and therefore came to rely almost entirely on centralized state as the only nationalizing instrument available for its mission. Hence, the old nationalism was intimately bound up with abstraction, alienation, and serving of special rather than authentically national interests, and the consolidation of state power against its own society. This is so important. Okay, this is so important. The fact that the managerial powers needed to centralize, but could not find any shared identity or ideology to do so, meant that they had to build their entire ideology in opposition to American identity. That's why, again, this paragraph is just so important. That's why our current government is constructed to hate you. That's why our current regime is designed to destroy you. It needed to from the beginning. You were always, your beliefs, your identity, your way of being was always an obstacle to centralization. And in order to nationalize, in order to centralize in the way that it wanted, the only way that the power could do this was to become an opponent of American identity, an opponent of the American people. It's not just that the left chose to be anti-American, okay? It's that it was actually mechanically necessary for the advance of power. And that's not just the left. That's also evident in some areas of the right. When you look at neoconservatism, it has the same problem. It's a different flavor. It's taking different people who hate middle America and forming them together. But there's a reason that all of these projects to centralize power have to hate middle America, have to hate the American identity. They can never align themselves with the value of Americans. And this is why. Again, very important. What a new middle American nationalism must seek is a redefinition of nationalism away from the terms of the old. Since a middle American nationalism bases itself on the actual interests and norms of a concrete social group, it will not display the same adversarial alienation that affected the pseudo nationalism it seeks to replace, nor will it need to rely on the power of the national state to the same degree or in the same way. Nevertheless, the mission of the new nationalism must be not merely the winning of formal political power through elections and roll call votes, but also the acquisition of substantive social power and the displacement of the incumbent managerial elite of the regime by its own elite drawn from and representing the middle American social stratum. When we say counter elite, when we talk about the rotation of elites, the circulation of elites, this is what we're talking about right here. No social group becomes an elite unless it makes use of the instruments of force that are at the heart of state, and hence a middle American nationalism cannot expect to achieve its goals unless it employs the state to reward its own socio-political base and exclude its rivals from access to rewards. If this sounds familiar, it's reward your friends and punish your enemies. He says, look, even if we don't like the centralized state, we're going to need control of the centralized state in order to use the power that it has to dismantle aspects we don't like. We're going to need it. We're going to need to reward our friends and punish our enemies if we're going to be able to move the needle on this. So any conservative who's over there twiddling their thumb saying, we can't use power, we can't use power. This is Sam Francis saying, shut up. Okay. Your way does not work. Yours is the failed way that we have been leading conservatives down the entire time. We have to recognize the need to control not just government, as he points out here, but cultural power and being able to wield that power, being willing to wield that power, both to reward friends and punish enemies. A middle American nationalism must expect to redefine legal rules, political procedures, fiscal and budgetary mechanisms, and national policy generally in the interests of middle Americans, and it must do so with no illusions about rejecting, decentralizing, or dismantling the nation state or power it affords. So he says, look, you're going to need to keep most of this intact. You're going to need to organize society for the benefit of middle Americans, and you're going to need to be unapologetic towards it, and you should not be looking to dismantle the power of the state that affords you that control until you've made that transformation, even if you even want to do it at all. Again, maybe we agree or disagree with Francis's conclusion that we have to leave it entirely intact, but surely until we've at least completed the job of orienting our society towards the advantage of these people, it's simply not possible. Middle American interests are dependent on the nation state through various educational, fiscal, trade, and economic instruments, and a middle American nationalism ought to announce an explicit agenda of consolidating and enhancing these instruments. At the same time, a new nationalism must recognize that many of the organs of the national state exist only to serve the interests of the incumbent elite and its underclass allies. The arts and humanities endowments, most or all of the Department of Education, Labor, Commerce, Housing, and Urban Development, and Health and Human Services, and the civil rights enforcement agencies in those various departments. It should seek their outright abolition, as well as those agencies and departments in the national security bureaucracy that serve globalist and anti-nationalist agenda. Hey, guess what Donald Trump's doing? Donald Trump's getting rid of the Department of Education. Donald Trump is getting rid of the U.S. foreign aid that helps globalist organizations. Now, is he getting rid of all of these? No. Does he need to get rid of all of these? According to Sam Francis, he does. Again, Francis is saying we don't need to dismantle the entire state, but we need to specifically get rid of the branches and departments that are designed to only benefit the elites and the underclass that serves them. Like, those need to go. If the department does not serve the interests of middle Americans, it needs to go. So Trump is getting a good start on this, but he needs to widen his purview. But power based merely on the state is insufficient for the reconstitution of American society. under Middle American dominance. State power, indeed, through a prerequisite of emergencies of a for the emergence of a new elite, is itself a weak support and must be supplemented by cultural dominance. Under the incumbent elite and its regime, characteristic Middle American norms of sacrifice for and solidarity with family, community, ethnicity, nation, religion, morals, and their rules and tastes and their rules of taste and propriety are under continuous attack, subversion, and delegitimization by the cultural and intellectual vanguards of the elites. In place of such norms, the elite offer a ethic of hedonism, immediate gratification, and cosmopolitan or universalist dispersion of concrete identities and loyalties. Of an ethic that serves the interests of incumbent elites by encouraging a passive, homogenized, though fragmented culture of continuous consumption, distraction, entertainment, self-indulgence, surrender of social responsibilities to mass organizations, and the erosion of the concrete social identities and intermediary institutions that restrain restrain the centralized manipulative power of both political and corporate structures. By far, the most strategically important effort of an emerging Middle American counter elite would be a long countermarch through the institutions of the dominant culture: universities, think tanks, foundations, schools, arts, journalism, organized religion, the professions, labor organizations, corporations, not only to assert the legitimacy of Middle American culture and ethnic identity, norms, and institutions, but also to also to define American society in terms of them. Instead of an ethic of acquisitive individualism, immediate and perpetual gratification, distraction, and dispersion, the new nationalism should assert an ethic of solidarity and sacrifice, able to discipline and direct national energy and reinforce national, social, and ethnic bonds of identity. The pseudo-nationalist ethic of old nationalism that served only as a mask of for the pursuit of special interests will be replaced by the social ethic of an authentic nationalism that can summon and harness the genius of a people certain of its identity and its destiny. The myth of the managerial regime that America is merely a philosophical proposition about the equality of all mankind and therefore includes all of mankind must be replaced with a new myth of the nation as a historically and culturally unique order that commands loyalty, solidarity, and discipline and excludes those who do not or cannot assimilate to its forms and interests. This is the real meaning of America first. America must first not only among other nations, but first also among the other individual or class or sexual interests of its people. Unless a Middle American nationalism or any other socio-political movement can achieve such cultural hegemony through the formulation of an accepted public myth, its political power and economic resources will remain dependent on the cultural power of its adversaries and eventually will succumb to their manipulation as it takes its cues on goals and tactics from its opponents. I know we're running a little long here, but I want to finish this because it's so good and we've only got a few more paragraphs. If a new Middle American nationalism is in some respects a synthesis and a transcendence of the conventional poles of right and left, it is also in another sense the resolution of polar conflicts between the classical republicanism and nationalism around which so much of American political history has swung. Like the nationalist tradition, it concerns itself with the pragmatic defense of national interests in foreign affairs, military security, and political economy. But unlike old nationalism, it perceives a national interest beyond the pragmatic dimensions in the preservation of the distinct cultural and ethnic foundations of nationality. Recognize that the pragmatic, material, and economic conditions may and should defer to the more central norms without which pragmatism is merely a meaningless process. So he said there's nothing wrong with being pragmatic, but if you don't recognize who you're being pragmatic for, if you end up sacrificing the nation itself in the name of nationalism, then you didn't really do yourself any favors. The affirmation of national and cultural identity at the core of new nationalist ethic acquires a special importance at a time when massive immigration, a totalitarian and anti-white multicultural fanaticism, concerted economic warfare by foreign competitors, and forces of anti-national political globalism combine to jeopardize the cultural identity, demographic existence, economic autonomy, and national independence and sovereignty of the American nation. Like the Republican tradition, the new nationalism is essentially populist in tactics, locating the cultural and moral core of contemporary American society in a stratum that is the main victim of the regime that now prevails in the United States. Like republicanism, also, it is less interested in the abstract pursuit of luxury and empire, and in the defense of the characteristic norms and identity of the people it defines and represents. Like republicanism, it calls people to a duty higher than the mere accumulation than mere accumulation and aggrandizement, to a destiny of knowing who they are and where they came from and what they can be. If they remain able to answer the call, they and their posterity may yet be able to achieve both a virtue and power that neither old republicanism nor old nationalism were able to create. All right, guys. So that is the essay, Nationalism, Old and New, by Sam Francis, printed back in 1992 in Chronicles. Like I said, I wanted to get through it because I just felt like it's so prescient. It represents so many of the problems that we're looking at today. It contains many things that I came up kind of separately from this essay, but of course I was already influenced by Sam Francis, so not surprising that some of that was still here. And so I just thought it was well worth going through because very much this is still the essay of our times and something that we need to consider as we try to figure out what the American First Movement is supposed to be. All right, guys. Well, we're going to wrap this up. Doesn't look like we have any questions from the people today. So if it's your first time on this YouTube channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe. Make sure you click the bell notifications, all that stuff, so you know when we are going live. If you'd like to get your broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. If you'd like to support the show, then make sure that you head over to theblaze.com, click on Shop Blaze, or you go to shopblazemedia.com, or you can go to the Blaze. Either way, you'll get there. And you click on the Auron MacIntyre collection. There we've got a bunch of merch, including a new shirt, the Brutal American shirt, if you'd like to pick that up. And of course, if you would like to get my book, The Total State, which goes into depth on the thought of Sam Francis and connects it to other thinkers as well, you can pick that up at Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, pretty much anywhere books are sold. It's also got an audiobook version if you prefer to listen. All right, guys. Thank you, everybody, for watching. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Have a great weekend. And as always, I will talk to you next time.